Thank you so much for having me, Steve, and thank you for recognizing Decanty at the top of the remarks. You talked about thought partners, and Decanty and I actually first met when she was working in Detroit and served as a thought partner to me personally, us as a firm in her capacity there. And I was delighted when she moved to DC and we were able to recruit her to our team. And she's definitely a huge asset. And I so appreciate her work. So thank you for recognizing her. And I'm glad that you will get to hear more from her at the end of the week. Although I know she's on the line and promised to bail me out if I get any tough DC questions. I hope phone a friend is allowed in our time. So I thought I would start, I just have a few reflections on kind of the this moment and want to share with you a bit about what the firm is doing. It's always awkward to hear your full bio read out loud, but maybe not many people know that I actually cut my teeth doing community development in Cleveland. I work for Famigos Foundation. I was a project manager working in a predominantly Black community that on the what would have been the east side was bordered by University Circle, which is a super fancy area, right? It's Case Western Reserve, it's Cleveland Orchestra. And then on the south and west sides by the Cleveland Clinic, yet another elite institution. And yet the families in my community that I was working with in Huff, Glenville, St. Clair, Superior were struggling to keep their businesses open, experiencing stagnant home values, and everything that we know comes from the pressures of generational poverty. And then at a certain point, feeling a different set of pressures when gentrification set in. And that early work experience really resonated with my own personal experience. Even though I grew up about 45 minutes outside of the city, I saw firsthand how much place, neighborhoods, your zip code matter. Of course, I'm talking to fellow community development nerds. You are my brethren. We all know this. It's why we got into this game. In my case, before I had language for any of this, you know, I lived just a few blocks into a failing city school district. Had I lived a couple of blocks the other way, literally just a couple of blocks, I would have gone to the well-funded state public school, great test scores, all the new equipment. I mean, I'm not hanging on to any kind of jealousy or anything. I'm just saying it was a really nice place to go to school. I hold my experience close because I understand that I'm a statistical anomaly. And as much as we love stories about personal perseverance, and it's not really about me, like clearly I'm fine. It's about the values and stories we tell ourselves as Americans. We tell ourselves that we believe that all kids matter, like all kids, no matter where they grow up, should have the opportunity to reach their full economic potential, reach their maximum potential. But we know that's not the reality for a lot of our kids. There's a reason why my story feels like an outlier and not the norm. When I look back and I see what has continued to happen in my community, what I've seen continue to happen in struggling Black and brown neighborhoods all over this country. Our systems are just simply not set up to meet the needs of the most vulnerable among us. And we're working to change that. And we're so proud to be your partner on this journey. And let's be clear, I mean, it is a journey. The events unfolding around us where we have yet another death of an unarmed Black man at the hands of police, really re-raising and bringing long-held racial wounds back into the national consciousness. It's clear that there is no room for silence, no room for complacency. As a company and as a community, we're watching, we're listening, we're committed to being in this fight with you of naming and addressing systemic and structural racism wherever we find it. When you take those circumstances and you couple them with the COVID crisis, it really shines a bright light on the inequities that Black, Latinx, and other diverse communities continue to face every day. And it's built into our system. I mean, I very aware that this is not at all a new challenge. I mean, by hundreds of years, right? But we are at this moment where, since it's been brought into the national consciousness, I think we have a real opportunity to completely reimagine the systems around us and to think about how, in fact, we do build them with the most vulnerable in mind. And that's what gives me hope in this crazy moment, and the thing I cling to, and I think brings me full circle to everybody on this call, why we need to be partners in this fight together. So I know we have a short time. I want to mention a few things. First, I'm just going to give us a little information to kind of ground us in the effects of COVID on communities of color. And I want to put that into a context of a history of wealth inequality, so that finally I can pivot to what some of the potential solutions are, some of the things we're thinking about. And I hope that in our time, you know, I'd love to hear what others are thinking about in terms of some of those solutions. So first, COVID. I mean, I know folks on this call are living this every day, but I have to say it out loud. I mean, it's exacerbating the deep inequities in our economy. 33 million workers have applied for unemployment since March 15th. Latinx unemployment is at 18.9%, while African-American unemployment is estimated at 16.7%. At the same time, our communities are also overrepresented in jobs deemed essential. That means that we are more likely to be out of work, have lost wages, or lost a business, and more likely to be in jobs where you have high risk of exposure to the coronavirus. So this two-sided coin that's hitting our community is having ripple effects. I mean, we know that a lot of folks in our communities are not able to telecommute. They're trying to manage remote school. You may, in fact, see a cameo appearance by my kindergartner who may run in here and show herself. And we're all balancing a lot, but for so many of our community, it's more than a balancing act, right? They're literally their livelihoods and their health are at risk, and they're having to choose between the two. And again, this is against a backdrop in which our communities were already experiencing huge disparities. In the previous recession, the wealth of Black and Latinx families fell by more than 60%. We lost 60% of our wealth, compared to an average of 16% loss for white households. In 2016, the median wealth for Black and Hispanic families was $17,600 and $20,700 respectively, but compare that to median wealth for white families of $171,000. Again, I know that these statistics are well known for people on this call. In the district, it's even more stark. White households have 81 times more wealth than Black households. And we can see this even beyond the implications of the wealth divide when it comes just to managing day-to-day expenses. The JPMorgan Chase Institute released research that helps us better understand racial gaps in financial outcomes, as well as how families of different racial groups were weathering fluctuations in income. And they found that Black and Latinx family spending is more sensitive to short-term income fluctuations. Okay, so what does that actually mean? That means, going back to what we were just saying, lost wages, cut hours, really putting our families at risk. Black and Latinx families have just 30 to 40 cents of savings for every dollar held by white families. That means that those gaps in income or our cuts in wages, we are just really poorly positioned to be able to manage going through. So while government programs aimed at restoring lost income, including unemployment insurance and stimulus, they're important for everybody, but for us, that's a lifeline. For our communities, that is critical. So that is the challenge. Let's talk about our solutions, because I really do think that this is our moment, when there's no escaping the fact that we are undergoing a racial reckoning in the US and in the broader global consciousness. Now really is that time to address those systems and make them work better for everyone. So let me mention just a few things. First, immediately following the murder of George Floyd, we knew we had to act quickly. We made $3 million philanthropic commitment to promote racial and social equality by supporting civil rights organizations. So much more to do, but I think it was critical to get resources into the hands of nonprofits on the front lines of racial justice work. Also new for us, and this work is early and in the pilot phases for us, but we also made a grant and started a pilot to look at ways to foster healing and alleviate trauma in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And I feel like that's not the space that you see a lot of corporates stepping into, but Steve, since you read my entire bio, you know that I'm also a yoga teacher. And I think really being honest and incorporating into our thinking the trauma that our communities have experienced, that all of us on this call have likely experienced, and centering healing for our practitioners and for our communities is a critical way to think about this. So very early days for us on that work, but I'm excited that we stepped into that space. And then we had an early philanthropic response to COVID itself, deploying $50 million in immediate grants, many in the DC area, to address the immediate public health and long-term economic challenges, and committed an additional $150 million in below market rate financing for CDFI serving small businesses. So that allowed organizations receiving those funds to provide coaching, information, guidance, and advice to individuals and business owners as they're navigating a lot. I know you guys are all on the front lines of doing that with your clients and the families that you serve. The other was really promoting strategies to smooth incomes and try to provide a bridge until some of those public resources made it into families' hands. Of course, now we're looking for a renewal in support, but in those early days, people were waiting for unemployment insurance to kick in. They were waiting for relief checks to come. And through all of this, we really prioritized partnering with diverse-led organizations and partners with deep relationships in our Black and Latinx communities. This is against a track record of working with a number of initiatives designed by and for communities of color. I'll just name a couple that I think maybe folks on the phone might be familiar with. The Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, which is a network of investors and foundations, and now up to 12 CDFIs working in 5 metro areas, one of which is in the greater Washington area, and making sure that we're providing loans with some flexible criteria to Black and Brown and diverse-owned small businesses. DEC&T also spearheaded an effort to support MDIs. We deployed a $600,000 grant to Harbor Bank of Maryland to support Our Fair Share, which was a partnership between Combs Enterprise and MDIs like Harbor Bank. That's in addition to short-term relief for nonprofit developers and landlords through a couple of partners, and supporting work like Capital Impact Partners' Equitable Development Initiative to train diverse developers, minority developers. Let me just quickly say as well that, even though I'm the president of the foundation, I think it's important to note that dollars is just one thing that we bring to the table. We're also looking at how we can use our influence to advocate for policies that we know are really going to make a difference. And a good example of that is through our policy center, we advocated for changes to the CARES Act that would ensure that community lenders and small banks received PPP funds, because we knew they were getting loans to more underserved businesses, including Black and Latinx business owners. And then we're also, probably a lot of people are familiar with the data work through the JPMorgan Chase Institute leveraging that as much as we can. Just a final thought here in terms of solutions, I think is really important to note in this moment, which is, the philanthropy is incredibly important. And often we use our philanthropy as a way to innovate, to test solutions, but we know that scale really comes through our business. And this story would not be complete if I wasn't also talking about the ways that our business is stepping up. I'm really excited that very soon we will have an announcement to say more about this, but earlier this summer, the Business Roundtable created a committee on racial equity. And as a part of that, Jamie Dimon has been leading a subcommittee focused on the racial wealth divide. And so very soon we're going to be in a position to talk about the commitments that JPMorgan Chase is taking to address the racial wealth divide through our business. Yes, the philanthropy is great, but through our business, what more are we going to do around home lending, small business lending, investing in affordable housing, even looking up and down the income scale at our wealth advisors, our supplier diversity, and more. And then we know we can't do it alone. So what I'm really excited about is that's going to include a coalition of companies, very similar to how you think about organizing your anchor work here. Like, how can we all start rowing in the same direction? So that, I don't want to get ahead of that announcement because it's going to be very exciting, but you guys did get a little bit of a preview. So I really want to get to some of the questions. I will close with an expression of really deep gratitude for what you guys do every day. I really I've been there and worked on the front lines as you all have been doing, and I can't imagine trying to do that work remotely while managing care responsibilities, while grappling with a health crisis, while also being emotional, financial lifeline for so many of your clients in your communities. So I'm extremely grateful as your partner, also as a Greater Washington Region resident, but I appreciate everything that you're doing to build a more equitable community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to encourage people, if they have questions, to enter them into the Q&A, and if you don't figure out how to do that, I'll catch it in chat as well. As a chat feature, I want to reflect on something that you said early on about you said it so transparently. You said, "Hey, I'm okay," and I have to tell you, for me, that holds some personal inflection. By the time I was in college, I knew I was okay. Mm-hmm. And I didn't fully understand why, but one of my optics about being okay is that my mom and dad were happily married until they both died. And I didn't always have a mature appreciation of what that did, but I had an early and just as you said, you were talking about the zip codes and the 1 blocks away. At some point, those of us, many of us doing this work, at some point in our journey, we knew we were okay. We knew we wanted to do more to help others. And it's interesting just how different things make us okay. It also shows you the fragility that one thing not being there can make us not okay, and how we do that. You actually have answered some in your presentation of the questions I have, but one question I have is just maybe, I'd love to hear more. 2 things kind of left out. One, I loved hearing you talk about system change, because one of the things we've learned in our anchor work is that investment without system change is a false platform. And we're seeing that in our work with the institutions. We've figured out a way to help them grow, of how to help capitalize them, build their capacity, give them better technology. But without system change inside the larger institutions they're dealing with, those other supports can stagnate. They can be sitting there waiting, but there's not opportunity. Can you say a little more about that, the connection between investment and why the system change has to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a few things there. Oh, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. One thing is I'll say likely for people on this call, systems change is probably a familiar topic that you talk about with some frequency, and hopefully it's intuitive on what we mean by that. But I find that systems often feel invisible if the system is working for you, right? If the system's working for you, then you completely take for granted that there's an entire infrastructure around public education, a health system, purchasing systems that actually make our lives go. But when it doesn't work for you and you're on the outside of the system, you can see very clearly, what's at stake and what's missing. And so you have this ongoing tussle between, I think, not always like active resistance around systems change as much as you got a lot of people sitting around going like, but what? It seems to be working fine. And at a number of points, we've had to break down and explain, like, actually, it's not working fine. If you have a significant percentage of people for whom the system is failing, we're not getting equitable health outcomes, educational outcomes, asset building outcomes, then the system is fundamentally broken. And so we have to think about a rewiring for that. When you're not doing that, you're just putting a Band-Aid on the challenge, right? You might be able to pump enough money into an area to get a bunch of programs going that do some really good things. But when I think about the kind of work that you all are doing around supplier diversity and the anchor work, having been there at the beginning when you guys kicked off and hearing some of the stories, it's this fundamental rewiring to get institutions to think about how they purchase, how to purchase differently, how to create partnerships, how to align criteria to allow for scale, how to think about how they put those opportunities out. The fact of the matter is those systems were working great for a lot of people, but you had to get align interests, get people to crack it open and look at how to do it differently. When you do that and you couple it with like how then, a traditional programmatic investment, how do we get small businesses in a position to take advantage of those opportunities, then it's really powerful. But if we only work one side of those equations, we have a lot of really great small businesses with nowhere to go because the system's still not designed with them in mind.
And one of the things we've clearly learned is that people are custodians of those systems and don't even know what they're holding in place. They don't consciously know what they're holding in place. We have a question. How do we connect with JPMorgan's policy advocacy group to promote innovative ideas?
There's probably a lot there. So I think if we're talking about federal work or local work, either way, I'd say that DEC&T is probably your best conduit to kind of lift up. Mostly what we're trying to do now is take a look at kind of a virtuous circle between the investments that we're making, what we see is working, how do we lift that up to create policy opportunities or help inform the conversation, as well as the institute or the data provided by the JPMorgan Chase Institute. What does that tell us about policy? So I think we're very much interested in what you all are seeing and what's successful and what's innovative, and want to kind of bring that into our ecosystem. But I do want to manage expectations where we're not necessarily taking a position on like every bill that comes along, especially as we kind of build up our track record here. We're trying to build on the base of knowledge that we have based on the investments that we've made and our data capabilities.
Okay, so we got one curveball question, which I love. I'm actually dying to figure out how to answer this myself, which was, should we be talking about system change or system abolishment? I don't know if you want to take that, or we could tag team on that answer.
Well, I'll answer a question with a question, which is, it depends which system that we're talking about. I would agree that in some cases it feels like the systems that we operate within feel so fundamentally broken that we need to completely rethink them. but as somebody who's been involved in systems change work for a long time, I also know there's tremendous amount of opportunity when we can align interests and really shed light on where the gaps or whatever metaphor you want to use, where the pipes are falling down. And I wouldn't want to let those opportunities escape us. So I don't think any of these are one size fits all, but it is, I think for all of us, we're always evaluating what's the change opportunity in front of us, what's the best way to go about doing that. And it ranges from policy interventions to advocacy and activist interventions to programmatic and market solutions.
Great. So I have another one of mine, and this is a little bit for selfish reasons, but given your global perspective, are there any places or models or cities or any adjective you want to put in there that you think is getting it right? And you won't hurt our feelings if it's not DC. I mean, one thing I do love about the District of Columbia is that we're willing to learn from other places, other organizations, other cultures, and replicate models. Our landlord partnership fund, we replicated from a couple of other cities. Our anchor partnership, we learned from a couple of other cities. And I think the city as a government is willing to embrace other models. And I think our sector as community service providers are willing. Does anything leap out at you as?
Yeah, so a couple things I would say. One is, I think when I think about it from a city level or the regional level, the places that are making the biggest strides is where you see really well coordinated, cohesive tables where you've got the civic infrastructure, the civic leadership, private business, private companies, and government all at the table. And they have first and foremost a shared understanding of the problem, and then a shared understanding around the solutions. And that may feel obvious enough, it may feel pretty intuitive, but in fact it's really, really challenging. And I say start with a shared understanding of the problem, because I think we often find that having gone into different cities or regions and looked to make sizable investments like we've done in DC, we'll go in and the business community is over here. They think this is the biggest issue. Maybe it's parochial for them. Over here, like the community is focused on a totally different issue. Maybe local government is trying to win political points and like trying to figure out their next election. And then everybody's on a different page. They're solving a number of different problems. So the biggest success, whether it's macro issues or micro issues, is where we see that cohesion really come together. Mm-hmm. And I think that DC is really trending in the right direction there, the broader capital region, where there now mm-hmm. are a number of tables where we see these kinds of conversations happening. The other thing that is critical, and I think only becomes even more important as we move forward, is centering the voice and perspective of those most afflicted by the challenge that we're trying to solve. And this is something else that I think that our grantees in the Greater Capital Region have done really well. Also feels intuitive, but often does not happen. We know that people closest to the problem often have some of the best solutions. They don't always have the resources to get those solutions funded. So I think that's also what makes our grant makers like Deck and Tea so special and so important, because you got to dig deep and get close to organizations and communities to be able to find that piece, and then figure out from there, like, okay, how do you fuel those sets of solutions? That's been part of our practice, but I think going forward, it's got to play an even bigger role. And I say that because our current situation is so dynamic. It's shifting under our feet, that we've got to keep a pulse on where is the community, what do they need, maybe help them see around the corner on challenges yet to come, and work collaboratively, do more co-creation to really put solutions forward that are going to have that maximum impact.
You know, and this kind of inspires a follow-up. I know that JPMorgan, or I shouldn't say I know, I should say I have a great sense that JPMorgan Chase has amazing internal analytical abilities. You have thought leaders and research divisions and trend forecasting and all of that. But to balance that internal, external, have you seen a heightened need during COVID to listen differently, or to touch base differently, or to learn differently? I'm just curious. I mean, and I say that because prior to COVID, we at the community level would watch something come out from you all, and our response was, "Wow, that's on point. How did they figure that out?" And we welcomed it because it was consistent with somewhere between our insights and our complaints about what wasn't working in the world. And I'm just wondering, what's different for you all in this moment that appears to be shaping your future thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, how do we take that practice and discipline and put it on steroids, like bring it front and center in our process? When COVID crisis first really hit, those early months where we were all on lockdown, all of our grant makers hit the phones and tried to understand, as well as, put the brakes on our own operation and say, whoa, like, wait a minute, we need to pause. We need to shift our strategy and get it to highest needs. So that means, maybe stopping or pulling the plug on something we had planned, maybe continuing to work with the same set of grantees, but shifting up our strategy. And I think one of the biggest things that we heard was the uncertainty that so many of our nonprofit partners were facing. So it was hard for them to say, how many people are you going to serve? If I just think about our typical application, which is like, neat and tidy, here's the program, here's the innovation, here's the thing I'm going to pilot, and I have a mechanism for estimating what the potential outcome or impact of that is going to be. This was, my community is in free fall. People are losing their jobs. They're losing their businesses all around us. I just know that I have to get out there on the street and help them as quickly as possible. They didn't have time for lengthy applications. They didn't always know what they were going to need to do. So that listening caused us to reduce some of the steps on our applications. We started doing things like parallel tracking as soon as an application came in on payments, which is kind of a wonky thing, but I'm sure folks on this webinar appreciate that. Meant like as soon as a grant contract was signed, we could pay people really quickly, and tried to build more flexibility into what people could use the funding for, so that they could be as responsive as possible to what was happening.
Yeah, I have to tell you, and this is going to sound like a shameful paid political announcement, but the phone calls that we got from Decade were just amazing. They were different than what we were getting. I will say this, that I think philanthropy and corporate giving was amazing broadly at doing what it had done with immediacy and with flexibility. I mean, I think we experienced that. But the calls from Decade were very different. They were like, okay, what's needed? Not by you, but people you're helping with, and what do we have to do to help you be more responsive and more holistic and more, and it was really comforting because, I mean, there were moments when our sector felt in some cases alone, in some cases, frankly, less important, even though that pivoted and turned quickly, where it became clear to everyone that we were relevant and we were needed and so forth. But it was great having the kind of a support and frankly compassion that we got. The calls with Decade were really, they were authentic. And it actually, the authenticity actually forced different thinking on our part, because we were never expecting, what do you need to do differently? And yes, we can be flexible. And all of a sudden we had to say, okay, what really matters? So I think you all and others got that right. Do have a question. Over the next 12 to 18 months, the workforce will be affected by the current COVID crisis. What steps are being taken to focus on the employment of Black and brown people given these new realities? And you touched on that some, but if you have more.
Yeah, we've become fond of saying the future of work is upon us, right? The trends around digitization of work, the automation of certain roles, the COVID crisis has absolutely accelerated that in a really serious way. So on one hand, back to the conversation we were having around systems change, like we have to change the way we're preparing people for those jobs. And we had a number of those underway. This is where I may tap Deck and T to make sure I get the name of our partners right in the greater capital region, but thinking about the Greater Washington Partnership work, Deck and T, that was already underway, but seems to have renewed significance. Deck and T, I'm going to ask you to speak to that in just a moment. But I also want to mention that it's just as critical that we do this internally when we look at our own workforce and where we are automating and where we see risk of job elimination due to automation. Those are roles that are dominated by Black and brown employees. And so we're going through our own reskilling and upskilling efforts to make sure that people are directed to career paths that have safe, secure, and upward mobility within our firm. Just wanting to be really honest about that, because I think we'll also learn as an employer from trying to do it ourselves and be able to bring that perspective into some of our grant making. Deck and T, is there anything that you wanted to say about the Greater Washington Partnership work?
Yeah, and thanks so much for the kind words, Steve and Janis. That's really great. And thank you. So definitely in terms of kind of how we're thinking about around reskilling, particularly in Ward 7 and 8, one of our longstanding partners who many of you know, Urban Ed, has been really instrumental in ensuring that residents east of the river have access and opportunity to really the growing tech sector that's expanding in this region. And so we're really leaning into some of our existing partners, but also as all of the folks who are doing distance learning are well aware of, and particularly for LMI school districts, we're seeing students really fall behind in terms of their performance in language as well as math and sciences. And it's those skills that gets young people into the opportunities of this region. And so we're working, as Janis mentioned, with the Greater Washington Partnership in 5 school districts to really think through those pathways, but not simply a pathway that's focused on meeting the needs of employers. It's really embedded in this wider equity question. And so how do we make sure that LMI students are able to have the resources, skills, and also access to work experience in this new environment so that they're showing up in our workforce in the near future.
Great, thanks. Thanks for those specifics. So Janis, this is a bit of a curveball question, and you can moonwalk away from this if you want. And it's about internal accountability. And the community development field here in DC for decades, like so many others, has kind of gotten, for lack of a better way of putting it, its street cred through who it serves. But in this new era of racial equity, there's a need to challenge ourselves differently. And it is more internal accountability. And several things you've said today have suggested that JPMorgan is doing the inside-outside game, looking at investments, looking at philanthropy, but also looking at its own underbelly. And are there any insights? Because I mean, this is something that I think is an authentic challenge for the field when an entity has gone so long with the one optic of who do you help, but now it's, well, who's running you and who's governing you and those other things. Is there any insight that because I see sincere reach for figuring out what that looks like and what getting it right looks like. I don't know that our field is fully equipped yet. And I think the yet is the key part. But I just wonder if you have any insights about that.
Yeah, you mean in this, I want to make sure I understand your question, Steve. You're talking about the community development field itself and how to grapple with kind of the expanding question on equity.
Yeah, because I'm assuming the easy part for JPMorgan was who are we giving to and who are we investing in? That's kind of I mean, it's a challenge and it may be threatening, but less so than who's running us and who's in the senior VP slots. And I wouldn't focus just on jobs and positions and titles, but still that broader, how do we look inward and make sure that we are also not custodians of the culture that harms?
Yeah. So I think speaking to both JPMorgan and then extrapolating out to the community development field, you know, if we agree that a certain set of things are true, then it behooves us to kind of take our own medicine, right? And among those are believing that a diverse set of experiences, not just like, yes, diversity, but also putting people who have lived experience in decision-making roles, that actually makes us better as a company, that makes us better as a field, then it follows that we've got to have efforts to make that happen, right? If I think it's, on one hand, it is easier to say like, oh, who do you serve? Oh, you put up like these nice numbers. But I do think that the how do I say this? The standard for all of us is going up, right? It's not just about our outputs. It's not just about how many affordable units we produced or how many small businesses we served. It's about what is that that intended impact, right? Mm-hmm. It's are we also helping to deconcentrate poverty? Are we also helping, did we just displace residents and make the numbers look better, or did we actually help residents in those communities move from surviving to thriving, from sort of subsistence to resiliency? And that's a really complicated, those are complicated questions that I think we as a field have to grapple with, how we measure and how we understand that work. But I query whether or not we can actually get to those outcomes if we don't have around our table people who come from those communities, who carry lived experience that is similar or aligned with what the communities we're serving experience. And that's not to say that nobody else can do it. Of course, we have a lot of talented people, you know, particularly in the DC area, myself, like we moved here, we're not natives, born and raised, but it's, but that's gotta be part of how we do this work, is to make sure that those voices are there. And I think that's also true for JPMorgan Chase. I can say in my 7 years at the foundation, our work has been completely transformed by the talent that we've brought in and have brought to the table. And so if the old adage, personnel is policy, is true, then whether it's our company or it's our field or it's our individual nonprofit, like that talent we bring to the table, it shapes the agenda, it defines the problem, and it therefore defines like how we go about the solutions.
Thank you. Well, we are, time flies when you're having fun with friends. Janis, I'm gonna ask you if you want to make any closing statement, but I just want to say thank you for kicking off Community Development Week 2020. It's been great, you know, getting your inflections about the moment we're in and the way ahead. and, you know, focusing on solutions and, you know, not being afraid to take on systemic causes, all of that which you have brought to us today. I just want to say we so immensely value and have benefited from the partnership, and I do mean partnership. I love the checks, don't get me wrong, but the partnership with JPMorgan and with T, and it's the leadership above and below that is mattering. What you all are doing at the large level, coupled with having an amazing partner in T and other parts of the team that we work with as well, has really driven some things in some new directions and challenged us in new ways and supported us in others. So I want to say thank you. CNHED members, I just want to say stay tuned for the rest of the week, but I really want to commend you for how you've stood up and stood in this time, and what a difference you are making for the city in one of its most challenging moments, and how I think that you're going to matter as we not only continue with reopening DC, but then fall into recovery mode as well. So CNHED, congratulations. It's been a heck of a 2020. Janis, any closing remarks you want to make?
No, I just thank you to everybody. Thank you again for the work you do every day. And I wish you the best. It's like the best thing ever. It's Community Development Week. So congratulations, and I hope you all enjoy the week.
All right. Thank you, Janis.
Thank you all.